In Egypt, a pharaoh's afterlife begins with a regulation: 70 days. Herodotus says the corpse is kept covered in natron for 70 days. But for a longer time than this, it is not permitted. Not faith, not poetry. A deadline. So here's the big question. Why did Egypt make disassembly sacred? Was mummification salvation, or a state technology for controlling decay, memory, and obedience? We're not guessing. We'll follow the receipts. Greek eyewitness descriptions, Book of the Dead papyri, museum objects, and the most uncomfortable evidence of all. An embalming workshop at Saqqara, where jars were labelled, and modern chemistry matched those labels to real ingredients. Viewer discretion advised. If you value the historical record, subscribe. When the ledger closes, the bones still speak. The second the king stops breathing, the palace doesn't just mourn, it reorganizes. Because the pharaoh is not allowed to become ordinary. A normal corpse collapses into smell, fluid, and disappearance, nature's blunt democracy. A pharaoh's body must resist that democracy long enough to become a symbol again. And the symbol is built, not prayed into existence. Ancient accounts describe a process that reads like engineering. The body is treated and surrendered to natron, salt-driven dehydration that strips moisture from flesh with mechanical patience. The point isn't beauty. The point is control. Slow rot is chaos, and chaos is political poison. After the drying period, Herodotus describes washing the body, then wrapping it in fine linen bands, sealing the layers with gum as glue. That line matters because it isn't metaphor. It's a materials list. It tells you this was not just religion. It was craft, timing, and standard practice. And sacred does not mean gentle. It means authorized. To make a pharaoh eternal, embalmers had to do what ordinary people were forbidden to do: open the body, empty it, and rebuild it. Later writers like Diodorus describe embalmers as specialists and hint at priced options. Different levels of preservation depending on what the family could pay. Eternity wasn't a single experience. It was a tiered product. If you can sell people different grades of forever, then forever is no longer a mystery. It's an economy. Now jump forward to what archaeology has exposed in cold detail. At Saqqara, researchers examined an embalming workshop from the late period and found vessels marked with instructions: what the substance was for, where it went. They didn't stop at reading the words. They tested the residues. The results show targeted mixtures of oils, tars, and resins used for specific body zones, especially the head and the wrappings. In other words, the afterlife ran on recipes, and recipes ran on supply chains. Some of those substances point beyond the Nile Valley: resins and aromatics tied to long-distance trade, which means sacred mummification wasn't only a belief system, it was a logistics system. Someone had to source it, transport it, guard it, and control who received it. So don't picture a quiet tomb. Picture a workshop where decay is treated like an enemy, where priests certify the result, and where a dead king is rebuilt into political proof. Order survives, because the state can make even rot obey. Forget the tomb for a moment. The tomb is marketing. The tomb is the billboard. The real engine of eternity is a workshop, hot, cramped, and busy, like a factory that has learned to speak in prayers. If you want to understand mummification, stop imagining mystery and start imagining workflow. Because what happens next is not a single ritual. It's a chained sequence of tasks where one mistake ruins everything. Rot blooms, skin slips, the face collapses, the king becomes ordinary. And ordinary, in a state built on divine kingship, is a political disaster. This is where the sacred turns logistical. At Saqqara, near the step pyramid complex, archaeology exposed a late-period embalming operation that doesn't look like myth. It looks like a production site. Containers were marked with instructions. Substances were stored like inventory. And when modern researchers analyzed the residues, the chemistry didn't contradict the labels. It confirmed them. That single fact should change how you picture the afterlife. It was written down, mixed, measured, and repeated. A recipe is a confession that the sacred can be standardized. So, walk in with me. The first thing you notice is division of labor. Not everyone is a priest. Not everyone is a butcher. The work is split because contamination is the enemy and time is the ruler. There are the cutters who open the body, the washers who clean it, the packers who fill cavities, the mixers who prepare balms, the wrappers who bind the body into a new shape, and the ritual specialists who authorize each stage so the violence can wear a halo. This is how power protects itself, by turning brutality into a job description. The second thing you notice is the smell. It's not only death, it's oils, resins, smoke, sharp salts, and the sweet heaviness of aromatics, because scent is part of control. A decomposing body announces itself. It revolts the living. It triggers panic, impurity, the fear that the divine order has failed. So the workshop fights odor, the way a palace fights rumor, aggressively, constantly, and with expensive materials. And that expense matters, because holy is never free. Holy is funded. Resins and aromatics are not just symbolic. Many are chemically hostile to microbes. They seal, disinfect, and slow the biological riot that follows death. The Saqqara evidence suggests targeted mixtures for different purposes. One for the head and face, another for the wrappings, meaning the process was not random. It was tuned. A tuned process requires supply, and supply requires networks. Some materials came from local plants and animal fats. Others point outward, toward long-distance trade routes and controlled access. That's not a side detail. It's the heart of the system. Only a state with reach can promise eternity at scale. Now look at the jars. Labeled containers are a nightmare for romantic storytelling because labels are what you use when you expect someone else to do the task tomorrow. A label implies continuity. It implies training. It implies that if one worker dies, another can take his place and still make the balm correct. That's bureaucracy. That's industrial thinking disguised as religion. And it raises an ugly question. If the afterlife can be standardized, then who gets the standard? And who gets the cheap imitation? Ancient writers already hint at the answer. Diodorus describes different levels of embalming by cost, as if the dead were choosing packages. That means eternity is not merely belief, it is distribution. It is access. So the workshop is not only preserving a body, it is sorting society. The king gets the full chain, the best materials, the strictest timing, the most labor, the most careful reconstruction, not because the gods demand it, but because the state demands it. A pharaoh who decays like anyone else is a crack in the theology, and theology is a governing tool. If the ruler is divine, then order is natural, and obedience is rational. If the ruler rots publicly, if the face collapses, if the smell escapes, then divinity becomes a costume, and the state becomes just another human arrangement that can be challenged. That's why the workshop replaces the funeral. A funeral is grief. A workshop is control, and control requires an audience, even if the audience never sees the room, because the result will be displayed. The wrapped body becomes an icon, a face restored, limbs stabilized, identity reassembled. It tells the living, the king does not disappear. He transitions, he continues. The state continues with him. But there's still a problem. A preserved body is not yet a functioning person in Egyptian logic. It's a sealed object, dry, stable, and silent. It can last, but it cannot speak. It cannot eat. It cannot breathe. It cannot pass judgment. It cannot testify in the afterlife court. The workshop doesn't begin with incense. It begins with a decision. Where to violate the body without violating the order. Because in Egypt, the corpse is not just meat. It's identity. It's legal evidence that a person existed and still has claims, property, lineage, ritual status, and a future in the next world. If you destroy the body, you don't just kill someone twice, you erase their ability to be recognized. So the first cut is not simply anatomical, it's political. Ancient writers describe the act plainly. The body is opened, the inside is removed, the cavities are treated, and the shell is preserved. Strip away the euphemisms, and you're left with a horrifying truth. Egyptian salvation required disassembly. The sacred begins with what looks like desecration. Modern viewers often call this primitive or superstitious. That story is comforting because it lets us look down on them. But the evidence doesn't support comfort. What you're watching is not ignorance. It's institutional technique. The body has a problem. It is a biological machine designed to fail fast after death. The stomach and intestines bloom with bacteria. Enzymes begin to digest tissues. Liquids shift. Gas expands. The face changes. If you want an intact person later, you cannot leave the inside intact now. Preservation demands violence. So the embalmers choose violence with rules. The cut, often described as made on the left side, creates a controlled entry point. Internal organs are removed, and what stays is treated as essential to identity. Different periods and different sources emphasize different details. But the logic remains consistent. The body must be emptied of its most dangerous rot zones, then stabilized into a new state. This is where the word sacred becomes a mask that hides labor. Because the cut is not only about biology, it's about responsibility. Someone must do the dirty part. Someone must touch the fluids. Someone must be seen doing it. And a society that fears impurity needs a way to blame the person who performs the necessary crime without stopping the crime. So Egypt builds a psychological mechanism: division. The cutter is not you. The cutter is a role, a function, a disposable hand that can be condemned, chased, or ritually insulted, while the institution continues untouched. You can keep the system pure by outsourcing the impurity to a specialist. This is how power launders guilt. Even if the details vary by era, the pattern is clear. Sacred procedures often include a sacrificial worker, someone who carries the moral stain so the elite can keep their hands clean. The pharaoh's body must be violated, but the pharaoh's divinity must remain intact. So the system creates distance between the violence and the meaning. Now, look at what happens after the organs are removed. They don't just disappear, they become objects of management. Some are dried, treated, and stored, sometimes in canopic containers under protective symbolism. That tells you something crucial. Egypt didn't think the inside was worthless. It thought the inside was dangerous, but still part of the person. The organs must be controlled, not abandoned. Then the cavity is processed. It is rinsed. It is packed with substances meant to dry, scent, and stabilize. These aren't random spices thrown in for drama. They're part of a strategy. Reduce moisture, reduce odor, reduce microbial activity, and make the body socially acceptable again. Because the dead body is not only a medical hazard, it's a social hazard. A rotting king undermines the story of kingship. A collapsing face undermines the face on the wall reliefs. A stench in the palace undermines the myth of divine order. So the embalming process does what politics always does. It doesn't eliminate the underlying reality. It manages how that reality is experienced. Then comes natron. Once the inside is dealt with, the body is surrendered to time and salt. Not one day, not a week. A measured span, long enough to extract moisture, short enough to avoid damaging the body's form beyond use. This is the chilling part. Decay is treated as something you can schedule, like taxes, like labor, like grain. That is not superstition. That is administration. Now step back and ask why a pharaoh needs this level of control. Because the afterlife, in Egyptian ideology, is not a vague heaven. It's a court system, a bureaucracy of judgment. And to stand in that court, the dead must have a functioning identity, not a soul floating in abstraction, a person who can see, speak, and answer. So the body is preserved as a platform for the self, which means mummification is not only about saving a corpse, it's about making a citizen of eternity. But here's the twist that should make you uncomfortable. If identity requires this expensive reconstruction, then identity becomes a privilege. If personhood after death depends on access to specialists, salts, linen, resins, and ritual certification, then the state has created a final hierarchy that reaches beyond the grave. And that's the real reason we can't dismiss the first cut as barbaric. Barbarism is chaotic cruelty. This is organized cruelty with a purpose. The body is opened so the state can close it again, sealed, stabilized, and stamped as eternal. Natron is not a metaphor. It is not symbolic purity. It is salt that does one brutal thing extremely well. It steals water. And water is where decay lives. The moment you die, your body becomes a wet country with no government. Enzymes begin the quiet coup. Bacteria expand into a population boom. Skin loosens. Features soften. The face, your public identity, start slipping away first. You can pray over that collapse, but prayer doesn't dry tissue. Natron does. This is why the most sacred phase of Egyptian mummification is also the most clinical. The body is surrendered to a chemical siege that turns a person into something closer to leather and wood than flesh. Herodotus gives us a detail that should sound less like religion and more like bureaucracy. The corpse is covered in natron for 70 days, and for longer than this, it is not permitted. That line matters because it implies oversight, not just tradition, not just custom, permission. Somewhere in the system, someone is counting. Think about what it means for a civilization to regulate the exact length of time a human corpse is allowed to sit in salt. It means mummification isn't simply a family's grief. It's a managed process with boundaries, probably because the goal is not only preservation, but a specific kind of preservation. A body that is dry enough to endure, yet intact enough to still be recognized, dressed, carried, and displayed. This is the point where the afterlife stops being dreamy and becomes logistical. If natron sits too long, the body can become brittle, distorted, over-dried, less king and more specimen. Too short, and moisture remains, rot returns, and the entire reconstruction becomes a lie that will fail inside the wrappings. The 70 days tradition isn't just a sacred number, it's a compromise between chemistry and politics. Because what the state needs is not merely a preserved corpse, it needs a convincing one. A pharaoh's authority depends on visibility, on the idea that divine kingship is stable, continuous, and protected by cosmic order. But death is the one force that treats kings like everyone else. Death makes the ruler ordinary. So, mummification is the state's counterattack, a controlled transformation designed to keep the king extraordinary even after he is powerless. Natron is how you make that transformation measurable. Salt is democratic. It doesn't care about titles. But once you place salt inside a ritual schedule, salt becomes an instrument of hierarchy. A poor body rots. A royal body is managed. The difference is not nature. The difference is access. And access is never accidental. A large quantity of natron doesn't appear out of nowhere. It has to be sourced, transported, stored, kept dry, and distributed. That implies institutions, workers, administrators, budgets, and places where the substance is controlled. Which means the most spiritual moment of the pharaoh's journey is anchored to the same machinery that moves grain and stone, supply chains. This is where the moral cost becomes clear. To preserve one body as eternal, a society must build an entire scaffolding of labor around death. People who touch rot, people who handle salt, people who wash, people who stitch, people who wrap, people who certify. None of them get pyramids. They get exposure. They get the smell. They get the risk. And they get the burden of making the lie hold. Because the public story is simple. The king becomes Osiris. The king survives. The king rules beyond death. The workshop story is uglier. The king survives because teams of specialists perform controlled violence on his remains, then lock the results inside linen like evidence in a case file. And the 70-day limit, permission, not just practice, suggests that this evidence must meet a standard. A body too wet is a threat. A body too broken is also a threat. Either failure cracks the narrative that Egypt's cosmos is orderly. So natron isn't just a preservative, it's an ideological filter. It forces the body into a state the society can tolerate: dry, silent, stable. It creates a corpse that doesn't leak chaos into the living world. It removes the stink that would contradict the temples. It removes the wetness that would remind everyone that the pharaoh is a mammal. It turns death into something presentable. And when you can make death presentable, you can make authority feel permanent. Now ask yourself what kind of psychology this creates for the living. If you grow up in a world where the king's body doesn't rot like your father's body, you learn something before anyone teaches it to you. Some people are protected by reality itself. Some people are allowed to defeat nature. Some people are more real than you are. That lesson is not delivered by speeches. It is delivered by a preserved face. This is why natron belongs in the center of the story. Not because it's exotic, but because it's honest. It admits the system's true obsession. Not heaven, not poetry, but control over what cannot be controlled. Yet, even after the salt has done its work, the body is not finished. Dry is not the same as alive. Stable is not the same as recognized. A dehydrated corpse can last, but it cannot function in the afterlife court. It still lacks something the Egyptians feared losing most: identity that can speak. So the question becomes sharper now, not softer. If the state can regulate decay, can it also regulate personhood? After natron, the body is dry enough to last. But the work of mummification is not just drying, it's accounting. Because once you cut a person open, you create a problem the Egyptians refused to ignore. What happens to the parts you removed? If you throw the organs away, you're admitting they were trash. And if parts of you can become trash, then you are not sacred. You are disposable. That idea is poison to a civilization that builds power on permanence. So, the organs are not simply discarded, they are managed. This is where canopic practice enters, not as trivia, but as evidence of how Egyptian religion thinks like administration. When lungs, liver, stomach, and intestines are separated and placed into dedicated containers, you're watching a worldview that treats the body like a set of assets. Each part has a function, a risk, and a protector. The self is no longer one thing. It is a portfolio, and portfolios need guardians. The 4 sons of Horus are often introduced like cute mythology, 4 names to memorize, but their function is colder than that. They are a security system. They attach divine enforcement to bodily logistics. The point isn't that a jar looks holy. The point is that a jar turns chaos into inventory. Let's slow down and look at the log. In life, the organs are hidden. They do their work in darkness. In death, they become the first enemy. Wet, bacterial, and fast to rot. That's why they were removed in the first place. But Egyptian ideology also insists the dead must remain a whole person in the next world, recognizable, functional, and protected. So the solution is compromise. Separate the organs to save the body, then preserve the organs separately to preserve the person. That is not superstition. That is systems thinking. The canopic set does 3 things at once. First, it extends preservation beyond the visible corpse. The body is not saved if its interior dissolves and is lost forever. The jars preserve what the wrappings cannot. Second, It creates an architecture of responsibility. Each jar has an assigned guardian figure, which means the parts are not merely stored, they are authorized. In a society where purity and danger matter, authorization is everything. Third, it marks status. Dedicated containers, iconography, and ritual attention require money, access, and trained labor. This is not something everyone gets equally. The afterlife might be universal in theory, but the equipment is not. And that inequality is the point, because what you are watching is not just religion. It's a social map engraved into death. Now imagine the scene. The dried body lies in the workshop, emptied and stabilized. Nearby, the organs, treated, dried, perhaps wrapped, are prepared for storage. You can almost hear the mental shift. This is no longer a man. This is a set of components moving through stages. A head that must be protected because it carries identity. A heart that carries morality. Lungs that once breathed the king's words. A liver that held his blood. Each part becomes symbolic because symbolism is how the system keeps the violence from looking like violence. But the violence is still there. What is a canopic jar, if not a polite container for a necessary horror? It is a way of saying, we didn't desecrate him, we preserved him. And that sentence is not neutral. It is propaganda. Because the jars don't just preserve flesh, they preserve the story that the state wants the living to believe. The king is still intact, still guarded, still accompanied by cosmic authority even in pieces. This matters politically because the pharaoh is not merely a ruler. He is a model of reality. He tells people what the universe is like. If the pharaoh's body is protected and reorganized after death, it suggests the cosmos itself is organized, legible, and controlled. That is the psychological payoff. The world feels governed, even when death tries to prove it isn't. But there's also a darker implication. If the self can be separated into jars, then the self can be handled, stored, sealed, labeled, guarded by officials of the divine bureaucracy. That means personhood is not only something you possess, it is something you can be granted, maintained, or lost depending on whether the system does its job. And systems do not treat everyone equally. The further you move down the social ladder, the more your afterlife equipment becomes fragile. Cheaper materials, fewer specialists, less controlled drying, fewer protective objects, fewer rituals performed with care. The body might still be preserved in some form, but the logic of canopic management, this full administrative protection, becomes less accessible. So while the tomb inscriptions sing about eternal life, the workshop whispers a harsher truth. Eternity has tears, and tears create obedience. Because when people believe the state can secure their body and identity beyond death, they will pay, they will comply, and they will accept hierarchy as cosmic design rather than human choice. But we still haven't reached the most revealing piece of this system, because canopic jars protect organs. They do not protect something even more fragile. The face the world recognizes, the features that carry legitimacy, the head that must look like the king even after death. This is why Part 6 turns to the most expensive, most revealing layer of the entire operation. The balms, oils, resins, waxes, and tars. Not for romance, for antimicrobial control, odor suppression, and ideological reconstruction. If natron is how Egypt defeats water, balm is how Egypt defeats everything else. Because dryness alone doesn't give you a king. Dryness gives you a husk. A body can be bone dry and still fail the real test. The face collapses, the skin splits, the wrappings stink, microbes creep back in the damp corners of linen. The corpse becomes durable, but not convincing. And for a divine monarchy, durable is not enough. The dead ruler must look like authority, smell like authority, and endure like authority. So the workshop turns to the layer people romanticize as fragrance. It's not fragrance. It's biosecurity dressed in perfume. Resins, oils, waxes, and tars do three things that matter more than prayer ever could. They seal surfaces against humidity. They inhibit microbial growth. They overwhelm the smell of death with something the living can tolerate, something that feels like ritual rather than decay. The sensory design is not decoration. It is psychological control. If the body smells divine, the story feels true. This is where modern science becomes an uncomfortable witness. At Saqqara, archaeologists didn't just find jars and guess. They found containers with instructions and then read the residue like a confession. The analysis showed that embalmers used different mixtures for different zones, especially for the head and for the wrappings. That one detail shatters the childish version of the story where they used some spices. No, they used targeted formulations. They treated the body the way a modern conservator treats a fragile artifact. Different materials for different vulnerabilities. And the ingredients are the real reveal. Beeswax, plant oils, animal fats, bitumen, tree resins from conifers, aromatic resins like pistacia, materials that harden, waterproof, and resist bacteria. Some of these are local enough to be practical, others are not. Some resins are linked to long-distance trade, substances like dammer and elemi that point beyond Egypt's immediate landscape. That matters because it means the afterlife was not only a belief system, it was a supply system. A pharaoh's immortality had a shipping route. Think about the implication. To keep one body from rotting, you need more than skill. You need access. Steady, protected access to rare substances. That requires money, networks, storage, and political stability. It requires ports, caravans, agreements, taxation, and control of who gets what. In other words, the balm on the king's skin is the fingerprint of the state. And once you see that, the moral cost becomes sharp. Because the more exotic the substance, the more human labor is hidden inside it. Someone harvested it, someone transported it, someone guarded it, someone risked sickness or violence along the route, someone took profit, someone paid the price. The tomb records the king. The trade route records the empire. This is the moment mummification stops being mystical and starts looking like what it really is. An industry that turns bodies into certified objects using a controlled menu of imported materials. And those materials are not neutral. Bitumen, for example, is not just a black dramatic goo. It changes texture, it seals, it darkens. It can create a uniform surface that hides imperfections, the cosmetic politics of preservation. Waxes bind fibers and close pores. Oils allow penetration into tissues. Resins harden into protective films. Every ingredient has a job. Every job serves one outcome: keep the king legible to the living and acceptable to the gods. But don't miss the deeper psychological mechanism. Balms don't only preserve the corpse, they preserve the story. A body that smells of rot tells you death is stronger than civilization. A body that smells of resin and incense tells you the opposite, that the kingdom has resources, that the priesthood has technique, that order is real. The scent itself becomes propaganda. It doesn't argue, it convinces. And the Saqqara evidence, these labeled vessels and consistent formulas, suggests this persuasion wasn't improvised, it was repeatable. And repeatable persuasion is not just religion, it's governance. Because once a society can mass produce the appearance of sanctity, it can mass produce obedience. Now look at who benefits. The king benefits, obviously. His body is rebuilt into an icon. The priesthood benefits. Ritual expertise becomes indispensable. The workshops benefit. Specialists turn technique into status. Traders benefit. Rare resins become sacred necessities. Everyone inside the system gains power from the same central promise. We can protect you from annihilation. But that promise has a price. It makes eternity dependent on institutions, and institutions can withhold. So the balm is not just a substance, it is a gate. If you have access to the right mixtures, the right linen, the right rituals, your body becomes a protected object with a future. If you don't, you get decay, nature's equalizer, and you are remembered as briefly as your smell lasts. This is why the workshop replaced the funeral. A funeral is about grief. The workshop is about control over what grief means. It turns death into a managed event with a product at the end, a body that can be displayed, carried, entombed, and used as proof that the social order extends beyond the grave. But we're still not finished. Because even a perfectly preserved body is still only a sealed container. Dry, resin-coated, wrapped, and silent. It can endure for millennia and still be, in Egyptian terms, incomplete, because it cannot speak, cannot eat, cannot breathe, cannot see. It has form without function, and that is where the system becomes most confrontational. The wrappings are where mummification stops being preservation and becomes design. Natron dries the body, resins seal it. But linen is what turns a corpse into a recognizable person again, into a public object that can carry authority. Wrapping is not the final step because it is decorative. Wrapping is the final step because it is political. It rebuilds the image that death tried to erase. This is the part people describe like art. It isn't art, it's reconstruction. Herodotus doesn't treat it like a mystery. He treats it like a procedure. After the drying, the body is washed and then wrapped with linen bands, fixed in place with gum. That small detail, gum as glue, tells you everything. This is not a casual shroud. This is lamination. This is a deliberate effort to bind the body into a stable shape, to lock identity into place, like a document sealed with wax. Because a dead body does not hold its form the way living flesh does. Dried skin shrinks, cheeks hollow, eyelids sink, the nose collapses, fingers stiffen in wrong angles. If you bury the body like that, you admit death won. You admit the pharaoh is no longer what the statues claim he is. So the wrappings do what politics always does in a crisis. They rebuild the face. In elite mummification, the body is not simply wrapped as it is. It is often padded and shaped. Cavities are filled, limbs are positioned. The torso is stabilized, so the final silhouette looks intentional, less corpse and more king. Then the linen goes on in controlled layers, each layer tightened, aligned, and bonded. This is where the moral cost becomes hard to avoid. The pharaoh's immortality is manufactured by hands that must touch the most intimate remains of another human being over and over, until the body becomes an object that can be displayed without shame. The Egyptians understood something modern societies often pretend they don't. Identity is fragile. It can be destroyed by rot, but it can also be rebuilt by technology and narrative. And in Egypt, the technology is linen. Linen is not incidental. Linen is infrastructure. It requires flax cultivation, labor, weaving, bleaching, cutting into strips. It requires stockpiles. It requires skill. In other words, it requires an economy. The afterlife is not just theology, it is textile, and textiles are not equal. The finest linen, the kind associated with elite burials, signals status before anyone reads a single inscription. Even without seeing the face, you can see the class. The wrapping itself becomes a social badge. It tells everyone present at the burial, this person is worth more labor than you are. Then comes gum. Glue is control in liquid form. Gum makes linen. Stop being cloth and start being a shell. It seals layers, hardens surfaces, and locks the shape. When you glue a body into permanence, you are doing something more than preserving it. You are declaring what the body is allowed to become, and forbidding any further change. That is why wrapping is the psychological climax of the workshop. Because a decaying corpse is honest. A wrapped mummy is an argument. It argues that the king is stable. It argues that the king remains whole. It argues that the king's identity can survive in a world where everything else breaks. It argues, without words, that the state can outlast nature. And the argument has an audience, the living. Even if most people never enter the embalming space, they will hear about what happens there. They will see the result. They will learn the lesson. The king does not rot like you do. The king is processed, certified, protected, made durable by institutions that you rely on but do not control. This is how ritual produces complicity. The people who supply linen, the people who transport resins, the people who carve jars, the people who craft coffins, the people who chant and certify. Each one becomes a cog in the machine that manufactures eternity for the elite. No one has to say, obey. The wrapped body says it for them. But there is still a flaw in the reconstruction, and the Egyptians knew it. A mummy is stable, but it is mute. A wrapped body cannot eat offerings. It cannot speak its name. It cannot breathe the air of the afterlife. It cannot see the path. It cannot hear prayers. It is an icon without function. And that's a problem, because Egyptian afterlife belief is not passive. It is procedural. It involves travel, recognition, and judgment. The dead must appear before powers that demand words, oaths, and identity. A silent corpse is not ready for that court. So the system adds another layer, not of linen, but of authorization. A mummy is a solved biological problem. But in Egyptian logic, biology isn't the whole problem. A preserved body that cannot speak is still a failure, because the Egyptian afterlife is not a cloud you drift into. It's a system you must enter, navigate, and survive. It has gates, names, rules, threats. It has judges. It has traps. It has moments where silence is fatal. So after the workshop finishes shaping the corpse into a stable object, the priests face the final crisis. How do you turn an object back into a person? Egypt's answer is not sentimental, it's procedural. The opening of the mouth ceremony is often described in gentle museum language, restoring the senses. But if you strip away the softness, it reads like something a state would invent. A ritual certification that grants the dead the legal capacity to function. Not emotionally function. Function like a citizen of the next world. Because in the Egyptian imagination, the dead needs equipment. Not only jars and linen, but permissions. The ability to eat offerings, breathe air, speak names, and see the path. Without those capacities, the afterlife is not a reward. It's a locked door. And locked doors always create power. Think of what the priests are doing here. They are not simply mourning. They are performing a controlled act on a controlled object, using specialized tools and words in front of witnesses to produce a recognized outcome. This being is now enabled. That is how courts operate. That is how licensing operates. That is how power operates. The ceremony itself, whatever its precise variations across centuries, sits at the boundary between body and identity. It claims to reconnect the dead to sensory life. It is, in effect, a ritual that fights the most terrifying death of all. The death of the name. The death of recognition. The death of being able to respond when called. Because if you can't speak in the afterlife, you can't defend yourself. And defense is not optional in Egyptian cosmology. You don't just arrive. You are evaluated. You are challenged. You are tested. You are required to know words, names, and formulas. That is why funerary texts exist at all. They are manuals for survival. So when priests open the mouth, they are performing something like activation of a legal identity. The corpse is no longer merely preserved, it is authorized. Now ask what that means socially. If personhood in the next world requires ritual authorization, then the next world is not a free gift from gods. It is mediated by institutions. And institutions can charge, restrict, prioritize, and exclude. This is where the political psychology becomes visible. Mummification, as a system, teaches the living that continuity depends on compliance. You need the right substances. You need the right workers. You need the right rituals. You need the right words spoken by the right mouths. And the people who control those mouths, priests, sit at the center of the moral economy. They become the gatekeepers of survival. It is difficult to overstate how powerful that is. A monarchy can demand taxes. An army can demand obedience. But a priesthood that claims control over whether you remain a functioning person after death can demand something deeper: internal submission. Not just fear of punishment, but fear of annihilation, fear of becoming mute, lost and erased. This is why the ceremony is not a charming spiritual detail. It's a mechanism of governance that reaches beyond life. And it's why the sacred language is so effective. It hides coercion under beauty. Because what does opening of the mouth do psychologically for the audience? It provides closure. It provides comfort. It makes death look reversible in a controlled way. It tells families, your loved one is not trapped. He can eat, he can speak, he can breathe. But comfort is never neutral. Comfort is leverage. Once people believe that a ritual can restore agency to the dead, they will invest in that ritual. They will obey the specialists. They will accept the costs. They will accept the hierarchy, because the alternative is unbearable. A loved one preserved perfectly, yet powerless, sealed in linen like a prison. So the ceremony does what the workshop began. It converts death into a managed process with an authorized outcome. Yet, there is still one final system waiting beyond this activation. Because having a mouth is not the same as being safe. In Egypt, the afterlife contains a court. And the court does not care that your body was preserved beautifully. It cares what your heart weighs. Remain a person, you have built the perfect moral machine for the living. You've created a population that polices itself, not only because it fears prison or shame, but because it fears erasure. The worst punishment is not pain, it's being unmade. That's why the heart matters. In Egyptian thought, the heart isn't just an organ. It's the seat of memory, intention, truth. The part of you that carries what you did when no one watched. So the heart becomes the evidence you cannot bribe, the witness you cannot silence, the record you cannot rewrite. And then they weigh it. In famous depictions like the papyrus of Hunefor, the scene is almost bureaucratically clean. The heart is placed on one side of a balance, the feather of Ma'at, truth, order, on the other. Around it stand gods and officials, not as monsters, but as functionaries, a ritualized administration of eternity. And looming beside the scale is the most honest figure in the entire scene, the devourer, a composite predator, part lion, part crocodile, part hippopotamus, waiting like a penalty clause made flesh. Not hell, not eternal torture, something colder, termination. If the heart fails, you are not punished forever, you are ended. That is an extraordinary idea. It tells you that the Egyptians feared chaos more than pain. They didn't want endless suffering. They wanted order. And if you cannot fit into order, the system deletes you. This is where the afterlife becomes political psychology. Because a system that threatens annihilation does not need constant violence to maintain obedience. It only needs belief. And belief is cheaper than armies. But don't miss the deeper mechanics. This court does not function on spontaneity. It functions on language. The dead must speak. They must identify themselves. They must declare what they are and what they are not. The most famous element is the negative confession, a list of denials. I did not steal, I did not murder, I did not defraud, I did not lie. Whether every line was recited in every era isn't the point. The point is that morality is framed as a checklist, actions you can be audited for. That framing is not innocent. A checklist morality is a morality designed for governance. Because once morality becomes a list, it becomes teachable. It becomes enforceable. It becomes something priests can interpret, scribes can copy, and families can purchase in the form of texts placed with the dead. It becomes something you can comply with like you comply with a tax code, not because you feel pure, but because you fear consequences. So the Book of the Dead is not just religion. It's a survival manual that doubles as a civic curriculum. It tells people what counts as acceptable behavior by describing what the dead must deny having done. And it makes those rules feel cosmic, not political. This is the trick that empires and states love. Make your social order look like the universe. Now connect that back to the workshop. You spent parts 2 through 7 watching a corpse become an object, dried, sealed, wrapped, restored into a stable face. Then, in part 8, you watched priests activate the body, restore senses, speech, capacity. Why all that effort? Because this court demands a defendant who can function. If the dead cannot speak, they cannot deny. If they cannot deny, they cannot pass. If they cannot pass, they are erased. So every linen bandage and every resin layer is not just preservation, it's preparation for trial. The embalming industry does not merely keep bodies intact, it manufactures a client capable of navigating a cosmic bureaucracy. And that reveals the moral cost. Your afterlife becomes something you must qualify for. That sounds fair, until you realize who controls the qualifications. Who defines Ma'at in practice? Who teaches the confessions? Who sells the texts? Who certifies the rituals? Who decides which version of the right words is right enough? The priests do, and the state, through temples, wealth, and institutional continuity, supports the priesthood. So, the afterlife court is not only spiritual, it is structural. It reinforces hierarchy by making cosmic survival dependent on literacy, ritual access, and institutional mediation. Even when the doctrine says anyone can be judged, the equipment required to face judgment is not equally distributed. And that's the quiet violence, inequality made metaphysical. The most chilling part is that the court isn't presented as tyranny, it's presented as justice, which makes it stronger. A people will resist a king who looks greedy. They will tolerate, sometimes even love, a system that looks morally clean. The scale, the feather, the scripted denials, the impartial terror of annihilation, it feels righteous. It feels like the universe itself is watching. So what do you do as a living person under that belief? You conform, not just in public, but in private, because the witness you fear is inside you. That's the genius of it. The Egyptians did not need constant surveillance. They built surveillance into the soul. And now we're ready for the pivot. Because once you understand the afterlife as a court, the workshop changes meaning. Natron, resins, linen, jars, rituals, none of it is merely tradition. It's infrastructure for a legal universe, which forces the big question into its final shape. If eternity is administered like a government, then who profits from being the administrators? Once you've seen the workshop, the court, and the certification rituals, the afterlife stops looking like a dream. It looks like a system, and every system has beneficiaries. The cleanest clue comes from the ancient writers who describe embalming without reverence. Diodorus reports something brutally modern. Embalming came in priced options, not one sacred path, but multiple tiers, different treatments for different budgets. In other words, eternity was not simply granted, it was purchased. That single detail should reframe everything you've heard so far. Because if you can sell different grades of preservation, you've converted religion into an economy. You've turned fear into revenue. You've turned the afterlife into a marketplace where access is measured in coin, labor, and supply. Now go back through the process and watch it, like an accountant. Natron is not free. It must be mined, moved, stored, and kept dry. Linen is not free. Flax must be grown, harvested, spun, woven, and cut into strips. Gum is not free. Resins and oils are not free, especially the rare ones that travel across long routes. Jars are not free. Coffins are not free. Tomb space is not free. Priestly rituals are not free. Scribes, painters, carvers, guards, none of them work for prayers. So the question becomes sharper. When the state promises survival after death, who collects the payments in life? The answer is not one person. It's an ecosystem. Temples, workshops, traders, and bureaucratic labor networks that thrive on a single permanent demand. No one wants to be erased, and that demand does not go away in hard times. If anything, it increases. People buy protection when they are afraid. Mummification is a protection product. The workshop, then, is not a quaint tradition. It is a service industry with specialized labor, controlled materials, and institutional gatekeepers. It is religious, yes, but it is also economic infrastructure, like grain storage, like taxation, like armies, like ports. And like any infrastructure, it creates hierarchy. The elite get the complete package: controlled drying, high-quality linen, sophisticated balms, careful facial reconstruction, multiple ritual certifications, and texts to guide the dead through gates and courts. The poor get reduced versions, simpler drying, fewer costly imports, fewer ritual performances, fewer objects that signal status, fewer written aids. This matters because the afterlife system is not morally neutral. It doesn't simply mirror society, it reinforces it. If the king can afford the best techniques, then the king's body becomes a public argument. The universe wants him to last. If the poor cannot afford equivalent preservation, then their decay becomes an unspoken counter-argument. Some lives are meant to dissolve. That is how hierarchy becomes naturalized, not through speeches, through corpses. Now add the temple economy. Priests are not just religious. They are administrators of rituals, keepers of calendars, managers of property, and distributors of legitimacy. If you need priestly authorization, activation rituals, funerary rites, sacred words, then priests become unavoidable intermediaries between you and survival. And intermediaries charge. Even when the price is not explicit, it exists in obligations. Offerings, donations, labor, loyalty, social deference, and participation in temple life. If your future depends on their words, you will not casually oppose them. This is where economics and psychology fuse. The system doesn't just take your money, it takes your submission, because it makes submission feel like self-preservation. Now return to Saqqara's workshop evidence and realize what it implies economically. Labeled vessels, standardized mixtures, targeted balms for different parts of the body. That points to training regimes and repeatable production scales. And what scales becomes an industry. Industry creates specialization, and specialization creates power. The embalmers know things you don't. The mixers control scarce formulas. The traders control rare inputs. The scribes control the texts. The priests control the certifications. The tomb builders control the space. Each layer can extract value from the same fear, the fear of losing your voice in the afterlife court. And here's the most confrontational part. The economy of death is harder to resist than the economy of life. You can refuse luxury in life. You can endure poverty. But if you believe that a bad burial risks eternal annihilation, then you will bankrupt your family to avoid it. You will comply. You will pay. This is not theoretical. This is why funerary industries thrive in many cultures, because death anxiety is a stable market. Egypt simply industrialized it early and attached it to state ideology. But the economy of death does something else too. It spreads complicity. The people who build the afterlife system, farmers growing flax, workers mining salt, merchants moving resins, craftsmen making jars and coffins, priests performing rites, become invested in maintaining it. Not necessarily because they love it, but because it feeds them. It gives them status. It gives them roles that feel meaningful. A system with widespread employment becomes a system with widespread defenders. This is why mummification is not just about one body. It's about social cohesion through shared participation in a cosmology. Everyone has a part, and the pharaoh's preservation becomes the highest advertisement that the system works. If the king survives death, visibly, materially, then the promise feels credible for everyone else. Now we're close to resolving the big question, but not yet. Because the question isn't only who profits. It's, what is profit in a society obsessed with cosmic order? Profit is not only money. Profit is legitimacy. Profit is stability. Profit is the right to rule. Now we can answer the question that has been stalking every part of this story. Why did Egypt make disassembly sacred? Because sacredness is how you make violence feel like order. And order, real or performed, is the true product of divine kingship. A pharaoh does not rule by force alone. He rules by meaning. By the claim that his authority is not just political, but cosmic. That the world is arranged in a hierarchy that mirrors the gods. In that worldview, the king is not an elected administrator. He is a stabilizing principle. Death is the one event that exposes how fragile that principle is. Because death treats the king like a human. It makes him leak. It makes him swell. It makes him stink. It makes him disappear. If that happens publicly, if the king decays like everyone else, then the divine story collapses into a biological fact. He was always just a man. And once people accept that, obedience becomes negotiable. So, mummification is the state's answer to death's insult. It is not only a method to preserve a corpse, it is a method to preserve the premise of rule. Think about what the preserved royal body does psychologically for the living. It creates continuity you can see. It tells the population, the king is not gone. He has transitioned. The institutions remain. The cosmic order remains. The old reign has not ended in chaos. It has been processed into stability. That message matters most at the precise moment monarchies are most vulnerable: succession. Whenever a ruler dies, the state risks fracture. Rivals emerge. Priests, generals, and administrators reposition. The public senses weakness. Rumors bloom. fear spreads. A decaying corpse in that moment would be an emblem of disorder. So the state performs the opposite. It manufactures a corpse that looks controlled, sealed, and protected, as if reality itself respects the throne. The mummy becomes a political artifact. And notice what this artifact does. It turns time into loyalty. A living king can be hated. A dead king can be rewritten. Once embalmed and entombed, he becomes a fixed symbol that can be invoked in rituals, inscriptions, and state narratives. His body is no longer a person with flaws. It is a durable proof that kingship is bigger than any single life. That's why the mummification process is so meticulous about identity markers. The face, the posture, the intactness, the wrapping that signals status. It's not only for the dead's comfort, it's for the living's belief. The corpse must be legible as the same king who ruled, because the state's claim depends on recognizability. If the king is unrecognizable, the continuity breaks. Now consider the moral psychology of participation. The workshop system doesn't just preserve a ruler, it mobilizes society around the ruler. Farmers grow flax, miners harvest natron, traders move resins, artisans craft coffins, priests certify rites, scribes write texts, builders raise tombs, guards patrol sacred zones. Everyone's labor becomes part of the machine that asserts the king's eternal relevance. And once your livelihood depends on that machine, you become its defender. This is how mummification builds political stability, not only by symbol, but by employment, obligation, and shared investment in the story. If the story collapses, the economy collapses with it. So, everyone has an incentive to believe. And belief, once widespread, becomes reality's substitute. Now, bring the afterlife court back into view. We saw that the afterlife is imagined as judgment, heart weighed, truth demanded, annihilation threatened. That court is not separate from kingship. It reinforces the same ethic: order over chaos, truth over disorder, compliance over rebellion. Ma'at is not merely a virtue. It is the ideological language of state debility. When people are taught that the universe itself judges them for disrupting order, stealing, lying, harming social bonds, they internalize the state's moral code. They fear not only police, but cosmic erasure. That is governance at its most efficient. It makes surveillance internal. So why does the king need a preserved body in that system? Because the king is the state's proof that the system works. If Ma'at is real, the king must be its most perfect beneficiary. His survival after death, material, visible, certified, becomes the demonstration that cosmic order and political order are aligned. The mummy is propaganda, not because it lies, but because it selects what reality is allowed to show. It hides rot. It hides fragility. It hides the truth that death is the ultimate equalizer. And by hiding that truth, it protects hierarchy. This is where the big question resolves into an answer that is uncomfortable, because it is both /and. Mummification is salvation and control. It offers continuity to the dead, but it also offers continuity to the state. It comforts the family, but it also disciplines the population. It promises that identity can survive, but only through institutions that demand compliance. And the most confronting part is this: the system doesn't need to be fraudulent to be political. It only needs to be believed. People don't obey because they are stupid. They obey because the alternative, a world where kings rot, gods are silent, and your loved ones can be erased, is terrifying. Mummification sells the opposite, a universe where order is real and survival is possible, if you follow the rules. That is the philosophy of power at its most refined. Offer protection, then define the conditions. So what breaks the spell? What happens when the sacred is inspected not as myth, but as material? If ancient Egypt wanted you to believe eternity was mysterious, it did a brilliant job. It hid the process behind temple language. It dressed logistics in holiness. It turned disassembly into purification, and supply chains into offerings. It made the most intimate violence sound like salvation. But the ground has a bad habit. It keeps evidence. And modern science has an even worse habit, at least for empires. It doesn't care what a system claimed about itself. It cares what it used, what it left behind, what it measured, what it repeated. That is why the most devastating modern discovery isn't a golden mask. It's a workshop. Not the romantic idea of a secret chamber, but an operational site, where vessels were stored, substances were mixed, and instructions were written down as if this were a craft that needed continuity across workers and time. Some containers were labeled, and the residues inside those containers still carried molecular fingerprints. Chemistry can read what priests tried to translate into myth. This is not a small shift. It changes the genre of the story. Because once you can match a label to a real mixture, once you can identify specific resins, oils, waxes, and tars, you're no longer talking about ancient beliefs. You're talking about ancient engineering. You're talking about standardization. You're talking about repeatable formulas applied to specific body zones. You're talking about a system that treated the dead like a conservation problem with a sacred seal. And then the consequences crash in. If formulas exist, someone controlled them. If rare ingredients exist, someone controlled access to them. If specialized labor exists, someone decided who deserved that labor. Which means the afterlife, this supposedly universal horizon, was structured in life by institutions and inequality. That's the modern autopsy, the revelation that eternity had infrastructure, and infrastructure always has gatekeepers. But the most unsettling part isn't merely that Egyptians used chemistry. Of course they did. Human beings always use tools to fight fear. The unsettling part is what chemistry reveals about the purpose of the system. The purpose was never just to keep a body intact. The purpose was to keep a body legible. Legible to the gods, yes, but, more importantly, legible to the living. A preserved face tells the population that the state is not defeated by nature. It tells them the king doesn't dissolve like everyone else. It tells them that order is not a story. It's a physical property enforced by institutions. That is why the process is so strict about timing, why a deadline like 70 days matters, why wrappings are layered and glued, why scent is engineered, why organs are preserved in separate containers instead of tossed away, why rituals activate senses and voice, why the afterlife becomes a court with procedures, denials, and annihilation for failure. It's all one architecture. An architecture designed to make chaos look temporary and hierarchy look eternal. Now we can finally resolve the big question we posed at the beginning. Why did Egypt make disassembly sacred? Salvation or control? It was both, because in a divine monarchy, those two things are not opposites. Salvation was the product offered to the individual. Your name survives, your senses return, your heart is weighed fairly, you can live again beyond death. Control was the condition attached to that product. You only survive through the correct substances, the correct rituals, the correct words, certified by institutions that you don't command. Your afterlife becomes dependent on the same machinery that governs your life. That's not cynical. That's structural. And it's why this system lasted, because it didn't merely promise comfort. It promised order, and it built a visible demonstration of that promise. The king's body, dried, sealed, reconstructed, and placed into stone like a law made physical. Once you understand that, mummification stops looking like a quaint spiritual practice and starts looking like one of the most effective political technologies ever developed, a way to make obedience feel cosmic. Not by threatening you with a soldier's whip, by threatening you with silence. Because what's the true terror in this story? Not the cut, not the salt, not even the jars. The true terror is the possibility of being unable to answer. To reach the afterlife gate and have no words, to face the scale and have no defense, to be preserved, yet powerless, to be remembered, yet voiceless, to exist as an object without agency. Egypt offered an escape from that terror, if you accepted its rules. That is why people paid. That is why workshops thrived. That is why priests held power. That is why the dead were processed into icons. And that is why the state could present hierarchy as the natural shape of the universe instead of a human arrangement that could be challenged. So, when modern chemistry breaks the spell, it doesn't destroy Egyptian belief. It reveals its price tag. Eternity was never free. It was financed by labor, materials, trade, and institutional authority. The monuments show you glory. The workshop shows you the invoice. And when the invoice is visible, the moral ledger changes. Because the question is no longer, did they believe,